Hello, and welcome to another in my series of interviews where I'm talking to one of our many senior UX researchers from around the world. My name's Paul Blunden. I'm founder of UX247, and we help global brands improve their products and services by being more customer-centric. So let's meet my guest. Right, hello, and thank you for joining me today. Can I start by asking you to introduce yourself? What's your name and whereabouts are you located?
Hi, Paul. I'm Suzi, and I'm in London in the UK.
Right, okay, yeah, well, I knew that actually because I do know you, but how long have you lived there, Susie?
I've lived in London for 25 years or so, but I've been in the UK all my life.
Right, okay, so I've been doing these interviews with our sort of researchers from around the world, and quite a few of them are bilingual, often because, of course, they're not living in the UK. Do you have any other languages or?
I do. My mother's French and I speak some French, but I wouldn't by no stretch of the imagination call myself bilingual, even probably fluent. I can get by.
Right, okay, so you don't run research in other languages
No,
at all?
I don't know, but yeah, maybe sometime in the future.
Right. Okay. Well, I don't know how they do it. I must admit, flipping from one language to another, yeah, it always amazes me. But I'd like to ask how you got into research. I know you've been doing it a long time.
Yeah, it was so way back in 2002, which sort of reflects my age. I was working at the BBC. I was the editor of a music website, and we didn't know very much about our users. We had analytics, so we knew which pages people were going to and their paths around the website, but we really didn't have any idea why they were going to certain pages. And a lot of it was based around our assumptions. And there was very much a thing at the BBC in those days to say, oh, well, my mum likes this because, and you know, my mate always goes to da da da. And it wasn't just in the web, it was in radio as well, which is where I worked at BBC Radio. So I went to a conference one day, a one-day conference in UX, and I'd never even heard of UX. And I don't think it was even called user experience in those days. I can't remember what it was called. User-centered design, I think it was called, UCD. I went to a conference and I was completely hooked. So we went away and we just created our own little user testing studio. We just used a room, we set up a closed circuit TV, and we lured people off the street with the promise of coffee and biscuits and sometimes a tour of the radio theatre. And that didn't take much, really. And it was really quick and dirty. It was very kind of, we didn't really know what we were doing. We were just feeling our way. But the most important thing that came out of that was just a completely different approach to thinking about our users, like thinking about them as people who might surprise us and might not be like our mum or our mate or like ourselves. And that was really, that kind of actually filtered quite quickly through to management when they started hearing things that they weren't expecting. So yeah, it was a fantastic time, actually, really exciting.
Oh, it sounds it. Yeah, the sort of start of the industry, I think, is fascinating. When, I mean, I remember UCD, but also usability. You know, every agency was usability. Everybody was doing usability. It was a very different time to now. And you sound. I mean, obviously, over the last nearly 20 years, I suppose you've done a lot of research. Do you have a favorite methodology that you've used?
Yeah, I really love ethnographic type methods, ethnographic research, particularly diary studies. I really like diary studies because you're sort of following someone around almost. I mean, you're not physically following them around, but you're tracking them. For instance, you know, you might get them to send you WhatsApp messages every day telling you about their behavior. And the thing I like about it is partly I'm really nosy and it's really interesting hearing what people are doing. But I think it's really a really great way of understanding people's behaviors, which you don't get from an hour sitting in a room. Even if you conduct a really good interview, you just don't get it because it's while people are living their lives that things come up, interesting things come up. And the thing that I think is most powerful for is identifying needs, unmet needs. You know, I'm trying to do this and it's a real faff because I have to do this and then this and then. And so it's a great way to sort of spawn innovation to yield innovative ideas, things, you know, we'll need to fulfill this need, how will we do it? And that's where innovation can come from. So yeah, that's my favorite method.
Interesting. And the you mentioned ethnography and then diary study.
Yeah.
For those people who don't understand what ethnography is, could you explain a bit more?
I'm probably not the best person to define it, but ethnography, I think, comes out of anthropology. It just means, I think it just means observation. There's close observation. So there are different methods within ethnography. So diary studies is one. Another one is you can go to somebody's house and spend time watching them do things. You can, or their workplace. You can do interviews with them, which are very much based around what they do. So it's not really like anthropology. You don't spend a year sitting in their office watching them, but it's the kind of next best thing to it. I think that hopefully that's a reasonably decent explanation.
Very clear. Yes, thank you. That's really helpful. And so you started life at the BBC. Have you worked in other sectors?
Yeah, I think probably the sector I've worked most in is financial services. I've spent many years working for an agency, but embedded in a bank, a high street bank. And then the other sector I've done a lot in is B2B. So particularly sort of specialist content. So I work for the Economist Intelligence Unit, which produces content for economists and politicians and policymakers. And I've also worked for the British Medical Journal, which produces content for medical professionals. I quite like B2B. It's quite hard because you have to actually get to understand the content. Banking is, everybody uses money, right? And everybody banks, but economic content is quite challenging. So
yeah, we do a lot of B2B ourselves, and I think it's really interesting, but particularly when you're in commerce, of course, yourself. But the recruitment, I think, is always really, really hard to try and get that representative sample of the actual people using it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's bang on. I mean, it just can be a real headache, a real nightmare, because also when people are working in a field, they don't have time in their working life to give to things like this. They're always super busy, and particularly if you want to speak to senior people, really, really hard to get the people you need. And also it tends to be really specialist. The Economist Intelligence Unit is a tiny, tiny market. So it's like searching for a needle in the haystack, but incredibly rewarding once you find those people, because they're always super interesting.
Yes, definitely. And I wanted to ask, I've been asking everybody about the sort of the maturity of the market they work in. Obviously, if you worked in the UK for the last 20 years, I'm really interested in how sort of customer centric you think the market is and how customer centric brands are within it.
Yeah, I think companies in the UK companies are quite customer centric in the sense that they definitely want to know about their customers. I think there's quite a history of market research, and that's quite well understood. I think what companies are less good at is knowing really how their customers behave, because they're used to market research, which tells you what their customers have got to say, but that's not always the same as what they do. And I think that's where I think a lot of companies, the senior management, don't always get that UX tells you different things from market research, and that can get blurred, so that they end up asking UX professionals to produce marketing content and vice versa. So I think, yes, there's definitely the will in UK companies, and a lot of companies spend an awful lot of money on UX, but I don't think there's always the understanding at the senior level of what that customer centric, the different layers and the different parts of what different disciplines can offer in that area.
It's really in some ways quite disappointing that after 20 years we still have an education problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think yes, it is, isn't it? I think one thing that I've noticed happens is you can get ahead of UX who isn't really from a UX background, they're from marketing, and that can be really quite damaging because they're the person that's sort of talking to the level above. But I mean, I say that, but lots of companies, I mean, the bank that I worked in really did get UX and was doing amazing things, and hence they have a fantastic award-winning app, and people love using their services. So it's not all bad. There's definitely a lot good going on.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And what do you think the greatest challenge that brands and product directors face when they're undertaking a UX research study or getting involved?
I think this is maybe related to the last question. I think sometimes it's hard for them to know what they want to ask of their customers, because they might be actually asking them a market research question and they're coming to their UX professional. So there's a bit of that, I think. But even without that mix up, I think identifying what exactly is it you want to know. And I think a good researcher will be going back to them again and again saying, yeah, but what exactly do you want to know? And also not trying to know everything, trying to identify the research questions which are important, because any given research study can't know, or they can't answer everything. They answer certain questions. So I think it's about identifying the specific things that they want to know, and then getting the research professional to say, okay, so this is how I think we should approach addressing that question, answering that question.
So it sounds like sort of focus and clarity, really.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and also letting the researcher be in charge of deciding the method, because there's this tendency for the senior management to go, let's do some user testing, and then go, oh yes, what should we ask in the user testing? And in fact, it should be, let's find out how our customers feel about financial management. Researcher, tell me how to find that out. That kind of approach is sometimes it's better, but it's not always the approach that's taken.
No, quite. Okay, so you've long experience. I'm really interested to ask the next question about a flagship project or something that you remember and you're sort of very proud of. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. I mean, flagship is a funny word, isn't it? But because there could be projects that sound really impressive, but the ones that I love, the ones that really speak to me, I think it does come from banking, because I've found that asking people about money is surprisingly fascinating, surprisingly interesting. People feel very deeply about finances and money. So I did a project for this bank that I worked for, which was about money management and how people manage their money. And we did a diary study. We did lots of contextual interviews. We went into their homes, and it was quite a large study. And it was really fascinating. Some really good insights, great insights came out of it. For instance, the fact that when people are managing their money, it's almost like gardening. It's kind of constant tending. And if it's successful, it tends to be constant tending, and that makes people feel in control. And I had people who said that first thing they did when they woke up in the morning would be to look at their banking app. I mean, when they're sitting in bed, which to me is a bit crazy, they'd be looking at their banking apps. But I think what a lot of people don't realize is that many people in their lives are living sort of almost hand to mouth in terms of money. It's like this money comes in, this money goes out. It's like to keep my head just above water is a constant process of management. So I found that really interesting. Yeah, you didn't ask me about insights, but I'm telling you anyway. The other insight that I found fascinating was about what gets people to change their behaviors, because what the bank wanted to do was to find out how to change people's behaviors so they manage their money better, because it's in a bank's interest that people don't actually go overdrawn and don't default on loans and things like that. And one of the things we found was that there are major events that make people change their behavior, like going bankrupt, for instance, but there are also really little things. So when Monzo came along, lots of people changed their behavior because for the first time they could do things really easily and quickly, and that made them quite excited, and suddenly money became a bit more fun, and they could see how they were spending and that kind of thing. They could do little sort of things like they could move money around, put it in certain boxes to make sure it didn't get used and used when they didn't intend to, and that kind of thing. People get really excited by having little gizmos and tools and things, shiny new things. Yeah, so lots of interesting insights from that project. It really, as you can tell, a project that kind of has stayed with me.
Yes. And how did the research change the product?
Well, we developed the bank developed some money management kind of features in their app. So you can now go into the app and you can see how your spending was divided up, and you can look at your spending over time. And that was, I think, the intention when we started the study, was to build this content. But the study very much influenced what we built and how we built it. And I think it's good. I think the only thing that did come out of the project, which it's hard for the bank to hear, is that actually change in behaviours quite often end up being temporary. So I think that in the end, what's happened is that people used it for a while, and lots of people then stopped using it and went back to old behaviours. But yeah, I mean, it's a whole section of the app, and I think I still use it. I bank with them.
Right. Well, that's a pretty good, strong endorsement, I suppose,
Yeah, I
having
guess
worked
so.
on it. And
Yeah.
I'm really interested to ask about the sort of behaviours that you've sort of come across through research that perhaps are unique to the UK. Is there anything you've observed? I know it's difficult to sort of contrast that with other markets that you don't know, but I always think of a brand entering the UK. What are the things they've got to think about in terms of the kind of users they're going to come across?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say whether there are things that are completely unique to any market. I suppose there are probably behaviours that are linked to cultural norms. So I've been dealing with, not for my work, but personally, I've been dealing with the bureaucracy in France quite a lot. And I've been thinking quite a lot about how the British and the French compare. And I think the British actually are more pragmatic than some countries. They're not a race that likes bureaucracy. They're not a race that likes form filling. And I think possibly the upshot of that is that when it comes to using digital services, I think we may be pretty impatient. We want things to be easy. We want things to be quick. And if you make us fill in long forms and go through many pages and ask for lots of information, I suspect we probably maybe abandon more quickly than other nations which are more accustomed to a slightly more bureaucratic or a more sort of ponderous way of doing things. I mean, that's a bit of an assumption, but it is something that I do observe, is that people abandon incredibly quickly. When designers are watching people use their sort of carefully designed product, I think it's always a bit crushing to see how quickly they go, oh, yeah, bored with this now. I'll go and find an easier way of doing it, and I think that's something that designers have to contend with a lot and think about a lot, is making it as easy as possible. And also senior people have to think about, do we really need this bit of information? Do we really need to ask this of people? Yeah, so I guess that might be a thing which is particularly a UK feature. I'm not sure.
I think that's quite interesting, particularly when you contrast that with the maturity of the market in the UK generally for UX, which I think is one of the most mature in the world. I think possibly the most mature, and it makes you wonder whether there's causation. People need it, and therefore they're getting it. In terms of a good experience.
That's a really interesting point. whether they expect it, and companies have had to adapt. I think that's a really good point.
Well, I don't know, but it's really interesting hearing about it from you. So final couple of questions, Suzi. I'd be interested to ask you, what's inspiring you at the moment?
Well, I'm always, I said earlier, I'm nosy. I always like interviewing people. I always like hearing from people. I think I've done some interviews over the last year or so, a fair few interviews with small business owners or small to medium business owners, people in, I did a set of interviews of people in sort of manufacturing and haulage and those kind of industries, which are quite, I suppose they're long running interviews. They're part of Britain's history, aren't they? The Industrial Revolution. These kind of industries used to be our bread and butter. And I found interviewing these people I always love interviewing small business owners, because they just are so passionate and so driven. And there's no way you can stay alive in that environment without being driven. But they're also incredibly adaptable. So I did some interviews during the pandemic and after the pandemic, and they're just having to adapt to the most difficult, unpredictable circumstances. The haulage and any business relating to vehicles has been incredibly unpredictable. Raw materials and products have been really hard to get. Staff have been really hard to get, and they're just adapting. And I find that really inspiring. I mean, I couldn't do it. I really couldn't do it. I couldn't run a business like that. The work, it never stops, from the moment I wake up to the moment they go to bed. They are, eating, breathing, living that business. And I find that amazing.
it must be a real passion for them as much as it's a job and their own company. Them to commit that level of time and effort.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel that. I do feel that they usually love it. They tend to love it. I mean, you don't get people going, "Oh God, what a drag." You don't get people like that talking to researchers about their business. They're always passionate about it, and they, quite often they're family businesses, and they're working with a father or a brother or a sister, and yeah, and the whole family is sort of dedicated to the success of this business. They're without exception lovely people. I don't really know why. Very intelligent, very interesting, and very driven. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, good to hear that. And finally, Suzi, what's your biggest learning since you became a researcher?
Oh blimey. I don't know really. I suppose I think yeah, well, I like to I think I like to think that I've become more humble, or I've understood that I've got a lot to learn. I mean, I know that's a bit backward, but what I mean is that I've learned that I don't know everything, because when you're always interviewing people, you hear from people, you're always learning about them and about their lives, and there's always something new to learn. So I think I know about users. I think I know about banking and financial services. And then I interview somebody and they tell me something I don't know. So I think my learning is that I don't know things and that I'm learning all the time, and hopefully I've become a bit more humble and a bit more humble as a result.
I
Does that
think
make
that
sense?
it does make perfect sense. I think I'm not a researcher, but I've been in research for 20 years, and I think it's a unique position where you are constantly learning, not least, I think, through this period where technology has evolved so quickly and behaviors have changed, of course, as well. But I watch hundreds and hundreds of research sessions every year, and every one of them you take away something new that you weren't expecting. And I think it's a unique position that we find ourselves in. It's, yeah, fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you learn about human nature, I think, more than anything. But as you say, also about technology and about behavior. And yeah, it's a great job. I love it.
Good. Well, look, thank you, Suzi, for spending the time telling me about the great job today. It's been really interesting hearing about your career, what you've been doing. The financial services stuff, I think, was really, really insightful. And I'm sure anybody who's in that industry listening is going to be really curious about the work you've done there, and really enjoy hearing about it.
Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome. Thank you again. Well, I've known Suzi for quite a while, but one of the wonderful things about these interviews is I just learned so much more than I thought I knew. I hope you enjoyed that too. Certainly, Suzi's got so much knowledge about the financial services sector that came across so strongly. And I'm sure if you're working in that sector or curious about it, that was interesting. Anyway, my name's Paul Blunden. I'm founder of UX247. If you want to find out more about what we do, visit our website, which is ux247.com, or find me on LinkedIn and message me there. And of course, please subscribe to this channel, and there'll be another interview coming along soon. Thanks a lot.